At the vulnerable age of 12, Lara McDonnell was picked out by a gang of men who befriended her, showered her with attention and gained her trust. Manipulated and groomed, her life quickly spiraled out of control as the men trafficked her around the country, deliberately keeping her compliant with drink and drugs. Deeply disturbed and frightened about what the gang would do to her if she tried to break free, it would take over 4 years for Lara to find the strength to fight back and escape her nightmare. Human trafficking is a universal problem. It is a scourge that exists across the entire globe. It is a horrific crime that hides in plain sight and causes immense suffering for countless victims who are often the most vulnerable among us. It is also extremely lucrative and profitable. This modern-day slave trade is a threat to all nations and triggers all sorts of grave violations of human rights. It shatters families and communities, fuels organized crime, and undermines public health and security. The three most common types of human trafficking are forced labor, debt bondage, and sex trafficking. Forced labor, also known as involuntary servitude, is the biggest sector of trafficking in the world. For instance, a family gives up a child to an adoption agent in Nepal because they cannot afford to care for him. The child is then in turn sold to a sweatshop owner who forces the child to leave to sew garments without pay for hours each day. The child is usually malnourished and does not attend school. This is a typical example of forced labor or involuntary servitude. Debt bondage is another form of human trafficking in which an individual is forced to work in order to pay a debt. For example, a young woman from Russia has accumulated serious credit card debt and is desperate to pay it off. A man who identifies himself as an employment agent offers her a job in the United States as a domestic worker. She arrives in San Francisco with a valid visa, but her passport is immediately confiscated. She is brought to a home where her movement is restricted. She is then told that she must work as a housekeeper to pay off the costs of her travel, or her family will be killed. The young woman is in debt bondage. The third type is sex trafficking. Two women from Southeast Asia are brought into Los Angeles under the pretense that they will receive jobs as hostesses or waitresses. When they arrive, they are held captive and forced into prostitution while their captors controls the money they receive. Sex trafficking disproportionately affects women and children and involves forced participation in commercial sex acts. In the United States, any child under the age of 18 who has been involved in a commercial sex act is considered a trafficking victim. Women and girls make up 80% of the people trafficked transnationally. Yearly, traffickers exploit about 1 million children in the commercial sex trade. For example, a 15-year-old boy runs away from his home in San Jose, California, and ends up living on the streets of Los Angeles. He is seduced by a pimp who forces him into prostitution and controls all the acquired profits. Human trafficking is the second largest and fastest growing criminal industry in the world, with as many as 40 million individuals living in slavery-like conditions. Many mega cities around the world harbor this illegal activity. Cities like Paris, London, Amsterdam, Tokyo, New York, San Francisco, just to name a few, are not immune to the problem and have been considered prime destinations for human trafficking due to their ports, airports, industry, and rising immigrant populations. The International Labor Organization estimated that in 2017, sex trafficking and labor trafficking generated $99 billion and $51 billion in revenues worldwide, respectively. To put it into perspective, human trafficking almost matches the annual revenue of Starbucks, Nike, Facebook, and Disney combined, approximately $152 billion. What, if anything, can the Bible possibly say to us about the scandal of human trafficking? I strongly believe that there is an urgent need for all Christians to respond to and become involved in tackling this modern-day slavery. Just as the abolitionists responded to the great injustice of the slave trade in the 18th and the 19th centuries, so must we respond to this global scourge and crime of contemporary human trafficking. The Bible actually has a lot to say about this matter. Like so many victims of trafficking today, Joseph was sold by his own family. His story is recounted in the book of Genesis, chapter 37 to 50. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, but Rachel's firstborn. Of all the sons, Joseph was most favored by his father. As such, his brothers were quite jealous of Joseph and plotted to kill him. But when the brothers saw a caravan of merchants heading to Egypt, they decided to sell Joseph to these merchants for 20 pieces of silver instead. The fact that the Midianite caravan was ready to buy a slave to sell in Egypt tells us that the slave trade was already happening in the region at that time. Joseph was later sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials in Egypt. While he was attending to his daily tasks, Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph, who is described as handsome and good-looking. Joseph, however, resisted her sexual advances and ran away. Angered by this refusal, she made a false accusation of rape against Joseph, and he was therefore thrown into prison. As a slave, Joseph had no rights and no way to appeal when he was unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife. This is similar to the experience of many trafficking victims who are vulnerable to abuse. They are often falsely accused and are imprisoned for crimes they do not commit. Unfortunately, there are far too many cases of young teenage girls who could not resist and therefore are sexually and physically abused by their employers. Statistically, women and girls are disproportionately affected by modern slavery, accounting for about 21% of the overall total, while men and boys account for 29%. While in prison, Joseph became famous for interpreting dreams. One day, Pharaoh dreamt of 7 lean cows which devour 7 fat cows, and of 7 withered ears of grain that devour 7 fat ears. When Pharaoh's advisor failed to interpret the dream, a fellow prisoner remembered Joseph. Joseph was then summoned. He interpreted the dream as 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, and advised the Pharaoh to store the surplus of grain. Following the prediction, Joseph was released from prison and appointed as a vizier, a high-ranking official in Egypt. Just as there are many twists and turns in the story of Joseph, there are also many lessons one can learn. One important lesson is that although Joseph was a vulnerable victim, he was still created in the image of God, and thus God continued to care for him and protect him. 3 times in Joseph's story, the phrase, "but God was with him," is repeated and rendering us that no matter how terrible we are treated by others, whether one is sold, betrayed, or falsely accused, unjustly imprisoned, or forgotten, God's presence can carry us through difficult times. Furthermore, we are created equally in the image and likeness of God, and that is something no one can take away from us, no matter how defenseless we have become. The remarkable thing about Joseph is that as a trafficking survivor, he did not lose hope and faith. Sustained by God's mercy, Joseph was able to forgive his brothers who had sold him into slavery. Through Joseph, the whole family of Jacob was saved from a famine and was reunited with him in Egypt. Unfortunately, most trafficking survivors do not end so favorably. As Christians, we cannot and must not stand idle by and allow millions to be exploited by the unjust and criminal acts of human trafficking. We all have a moral duty to liberate these vulnerable captives. The Torah, the Jewish law, forbade human trafficking of fellow Israelites, and the penalty for those who committed this terrible crime is death. The book of Deuteronomy states, if someone is caught kidnapping another Israelite, enslaving or selling the Israelite, then that kidnapper shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. This commandment of the law is very clear and direct. Human trafficking is an abomination, and the person who commits this crime must be removed from society. The biblical prophets were very strong in speaking out against injustices to the poor and the vulnerable. The prophet Joel protests against human trafficking, including the selling of children in exchange for prostitutes and wine, and warns that similar things could happen to their own children. The prophet Amos strongly objects to the practice of human trafficking, chastising Israel because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Amos later writes, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." The author of the book of Proverbs admonishes everyone to speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. These principles can certainly apply to those hurt and victimized through the illegal practice of human trafficking. Following the directives of the law, prophets, and wisdom tradition, Jesus worked to liberate those who were held captives. Liberating the oppressed was his primary goal and mission. At his inaugural address at Nazareth, Jesus cited the words of the prophet Isaiah to announce his vocation and mission. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The reading that Jesus selected is actually a combination of Isaiah 61 and 58. This composite quotation defines Jesus' prophetic mission and ministry, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. Human trafficking is a contemporary slavery. It is basically holding someone in bondage and robbing that person's freedom and dignity. It is a vile crime against God and humanity. It treats a human life as if it were only a commodity that can be bought and sold, used, and discarded. Consequently, this crime contradicts everything God has formed and fashioned a human person who is so beautifully created in God's very own image. It is no wonder that Jesus worked so hard to restore the dignity of the human person.